There are three types of responses to trauma and threat: fight, flight, and freeze. When there's a moment of shock, the mind reacts in one of these three different ways, and you can't really control it because the part of the brain that senses fear sends signals to the nervous system, which, when activated, sends stress hormones into the body. So there is what seems to be happening at the same time, the mind and the body making moves as a response to the imminent danger that's happening. In this reaction, the entire body, including your organs, are tense. This is essentially a good thing because your body is supposed to have this reaction. For your body to react like this means that it has the ability to sense danger and therefore respond to protect you. However, when someone experiences chronic anxiety and depression, especially when it stems from trauma, these two powerful issues sort of exploit this response system. And anxiety can be extremely damaging to our heart, our lungs, and blood pressure, and indeed our spirit as well. In the midst of this anxiety, the mind gets confused and doesn't know when to tell the difference between hostile environments and safe environments. So the body is constantly tight. The mind is constantly at the ready to respond and react with tension. And it sort of anticipates that even when the actions of others don't necessarily merit the response. In other words, when you're tense, anything can trigger it. This same confusion that's caused by anxiety comes from a place of trauma, and until we know what that trauma is and process exercises that bring us through the trauma, our anxiety will get the best of us and even lie to us to say that this is just who we are. Lamentations, while speaking from the voice of the Israelites, does two things. It exposes the problem while at the same time separating our souls. In other words, our stress from the trauma, while is a pain we endure, does not speak for our souls. Stress through the trauma is definitely a reality. The Bible actually does help us process, not a way out, but a way with God in light of this. The same exact process is happening in Lamentations chapter 3. The people of Israel have experienced a devastating trauma. Babylon, a beast of a kingdom, went through the world that they knew and conquered every lesser kingdom that existed, including the kingdom of Israel. Jerusalem, the city where God settled on earth, meant to create a kingdom of wealth and prosperity for the Israelites, became the city desecrated by lesser beings than God himself. The former slaves who were brought out of slavery began to enter back into slavery and subordination once again. History and the issues kept repeating. So they were frustrated, they were defeated, and they were traumatized. At this point, I'm going to ask, where's the hope in this story? Lamentations is a book that doesn't necessarily get better. However, it does provide a little bit of hope in light of all of this, and this is how it does it. Well, first of all, it goes through the New Testaments. The Gospels and the letters do allude to the Roman occupation of the Kingdom of Israel. So from that, we know that Babylon later doesn't have any occupation, which means that at some point in Hebrew history, they get out of that situation. But even though the situation changes, the trauma is still there. And so what does Lamentations in this chapter say to help us move through the trauma? The process that Lamentations follows is one from exaggerated confusion to a stable hope. Chapter 3 verse 1 says this: I am the one who has seen affliction under the rod of God's wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. This is a real confession of what those people were feeling at the time. Their theology expressed the belief that it was God's wrath that led them to their anguish. What's interesting about this is two things. Number one, to the Israelites, God is responsible for their affliction. Number two, the crime doesn't necessarily meet the punishment for them. And so they were extremely confused about the exaggeration of their affliction. And the question then becomes, were we really that bad? And Lamentations doesn't answer any of these questions and still assumes God's hand all at the same time. It poses the reality of the punishment, then the exaggerated confusion, and leaves it at that. The reason why it stops at just the questions without leading to an answer was to relay to the rest of the Hebrew tribes that this is also what happens when you're experiencing a relationship and history with God. There is a suffering and you blame God, which is actually okay. The fact that lamentation exists in the Bible means that God's word has room for these kinds of fairly exaggerated, angry questions. And if God's word has room for it, then there's something to say for that. This is a trait that gets shamed a lot. Someone who is confused by their trauma will ask, am I that bad of a person and that God punishes me? And we are quick to answer and instruct them on how to do it better. But we actually never sit in the question with that person. It makes us tense when others are tense, so we want to rush the tension away from them. At the same time, there is a temptation to rush it by saying to just get over it. Or we tell them that they should just trust in God. But the question's still there. It's just hidden under the bed. Even when you hide something under the bed, though, it's still in the room. The issue of systemic racism is not necessarily going to have a good answer right off the bat overnight, nor is it something that we can just hide away really easily. By now, it's likely that you've had your conversations with many of your friends and family, and it's likely that you've heard so many people say their piece about what the real issue is. The truth is, though, we don't know any better than the people who have been immersed in this already. We especially don't know better than the person suffering from their trauma. Even proposed approaches is an attempt to solve the problem. But if we haven't been addressing these issues already, to begin to step into the mix with our ignorant opinions is to hop into a canoe down a river without a paddle. So what do? Well, we sit in the tension. And how do we sit in the tension? We listen and learn. Verse 20 of chapter 3 says this, my soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. The author is sitting in the tension. He's wrestling, he's meditating, and it's uncomfortable. If you've ever tried to pray and meditate in silence after a long series of stressful times, you know how hard that is. But it's necessary because that's what prayer truly is. A sitting in the tension that hopefully leads to a revelation. But that revelation for solutions doesn't come right away. It doesn't come overnight. So patience and practice in prayer calls us to sit in the tension as needed. And what's even more powerful is that these exercises are universally applicable to any community affected by trauma, anxiety, and especially oppression. When we seek to listen, learn, and pray, we offer the chance to sit with our neighbor, learn about their story and why their story of oppression causes the tension, and then pray with them and for them. In that process, we emit a light of hope. So how do we practice that? Well, the poet of Lamentations practices that on himself first. Verse 21, but this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Verse 22, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercy never comes to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. And he ends with this, the Lord is my portion. Says my soul, therefore I will have hope in him. We start with ourselves. We ask the questions, why are we tense? What trauma have I faced that I am carrying with me? And then you follow up with, even when I don't feel like I'm enough. And when you feel that statement becoming your reality, practice on those who are close to you next. Ask them their tension. Ask them their trauma. And then follow up with, even when you feel that you're not enough, God is your portion. We don't have the answers. We may never will. But at the very least, which is way more than enough, is that we have a hope in the Lord's faithfulness. We have a hope in the Lord's ability. We have a hope in the Lord's process. We have a hope in the Lord's timing, and we have a hope in the Lord's portion. And in our humility, we will allow the Lord to answer the questions and submit to his leading. Not acting like we have the answers, but being submissive to be lifelong learners, seeking God's leading toward the answers. And in the process, maybe our own anxieties can be humbled so that we don't have to react with fight, flight, or freeze, but rather to listen, learn, and pray. So my practice for you this week is this. What are ways that you can practice listening in your prayers? And what are things that you may need to listen for?